The courtroom was packed. Reporters lined the back wall, their cameras ready to capture a moment that could shake the very foundation of the American judiciary. The air crackled with anticipation as Pam Bondi, the United States Attorney General, entered the courtroom with the poise of a seasoned warrior. Today, she wasn't just here to prosecute another case, she was here to expose a conspiracy that reached the highest levels of power. At the center of the controversy sat Judge Malcolm Reiner, an imposing figure with a reputation for swift and often questionable rulings. He had spent years basking in the glow of his unchallenged authority. But Bondi knew what the public didn't. Reiner wasn't just corrupt. He was the linchpin in a judicial bribery scheme that had sent innocent people to prison while protecting the rich and guilty. Pam adjusted her blazer and took a deep breath. She had been waiting for this moment for months, collecting evidence, securing testimonies, and preparing to reveal the truth. The weight of justice bore down on her shoulders, but she welcomed it. The bailiff called the courtroom to order. All rise for the Honorable Judge Malcolm Reiner. Reiner strolled in, his black robe swishing behind him, a smug smile playing on his lips. He knew Bondi was formidable, but he had been untouchable for so long that the thought of being exposed in his own courtroom seemed laughable. The case before them on the surface was about a corporate fraud scandal involving billionaire Robert Langston, who had allegedly embezzled millions from government contracts. But Bondi knew the real story ran much deeper. Langston had bought his freedom through secret dealings with Reiner. "Ms. Bondi, you may begin," Reiner said, barely concealing his boredom. Bondi stepped forward, locking eyes with the jury. "Your Honor, before we proceed with today's trial, I have a preliminary motion that requires urgent attention." Reiner sighed. "Proceed." Bondi turned toward the courtroom gallery where a federal marshal stood waiting near the door. "Your Honor, I have reason to believe that this court has been compromised by you." A ripple of gasps spread through the courtroom. The reporter's pens scratched feverishly, and Langston himself sat up straighter, suddenly unsure of how protected he really was. Reiner let out a dry chuckle. "Ms. Bondi, I would remind you that this is my courtroom. If you're here to play theatrics, I suggest you take your drama elsewhere." Bondi smirked. "I have no interest in theatrics, Your Honor. But I do have an interest in justice." She turned to her assistant, who promptly handed her a thick manila folder. "I present to the court evidence of wire transfers, real estate transactions, and offshore accounts, each linking Judge Reiner to bribes received from individuals with pending cases in his courtroom." The room erupted into murmurs. Reiner's face twitched, but he quickly regained his composure. "This is absurd." Pam walked toward the jury, her voice calm but commanding. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have been led to believe that justice is blind, that the courts protect the innocent and punish the guilty. But what happens when the very person entrusted with upholding the law decides to sell it to the highest bidder?" She turned back to Reiner. "Do you deny that you received a $2 million deposit from Robert Langston's offshore account 2 weeks before you dismissed charges against his company?" Reiner's lips pressed into a thin line. "I will not dignify baseless accusations." Pam smiled knowingly. "Then perhaps this will help." She nodded toward the entrance. The doors swung open and in walked Special Agent Derek Mills from the FBI, holding a stack of official documents. "We have subpoenaed bank records, Your Honor. Every transaction, every illicit payment. And the damning part? Some of these payments were traced directly to cases where you overruled jury decisions in favor of those who paid you." Reiner's face turned an alarming shade of red. "I demand an immediate dismissal of these allegations." Bondi shook her head. "You don't get to dismiss evidence, Judge. You are the evidence." The courtroom was electric with tension. The jury exchanged glances. Langston's lawyer fumbled with his papers. And Reiner? Reiner clenched his fists, realizing for the first time in years that he wasn't in control. Bondi took a step closer. "This isn't your courtroom anymore, Malcolm. It belongs to the people. And the people deserve justice." Just then, Agent Mills approached the bench. "Your Honor, by order of the Department of Justice, I have a warrant for your immediate arrest." The courtroom exploded into chaos. Cameras flashed, reporters scrambled, and the gavel slammed down violently. Reiner's voice thundered, "I am still the presiding judge. You can't." But before he could finish, 2 federal marshals flanked him, reaching for his arms. For the first time in decades, Malcolm Reiner wasn't in control. And Pam Bondi had just made history. As the federal marshals grabbed Judge Malcolm Reiner's arms, the entire courtroom erupted in a mix of gasps, shouts, and hurried whispers. The reporters in the back furiously clicked their cameras, capturing the surreal moment, an untouchable judge being led away in handcuffs by the very system he had manipulated for years. Reiner's voice was laced with rage. "You have no authority to do this. I am a sitting federal judge." Pam Bondi stepped forward, her gaze steady. Not anymore. She turned to Agent Derek Mills. Take him into custody. The marshals moved swiftly, but Reiner resisted, jerking his arms back. You'll regret this, Bondi. Do you hear me? This is a mistake. His voice was shaking now, his usual arrogance cracking under the weight of reality. Pam remained calm, stepping closer until she was inches from the disgraced judge. The only mistake was thinking you could sell justice and never get caught. As the marshals tightened their grip, Reiner's struggle became futile. His power, his influence, his ability to sway decisions, all of it was gone in an instant. The courtroom was no longer his domain. Agent Mills read from the arrest warrant. Judge Malcolm Reiner, you are under arrest for obstruction of justice, bribery, conspiracy, and abuse of power. You have the right to remain silent. I am the law. Reiner barked, his face contorted with fury. You can't do this. I'll have every lawyer in Washington on this case by morning. Pam folded her arms. You can try. The marshals hauled Reiner toward the exit. Reporters swarmed forward, microphones thrust in every direction. Attorney General Bondi, did you anticipate this reaction? Did the Department of Justice authorize this operation? What does this mean for past cases he presided over? Pam held up her hand, silencing the noise. Justice is not for sale. This country was built on the principle that no one is above the law, not a billionaire, not a politician, and certainly not a corrupt judge. Today we send a message: the system will not be manipulated by those who think they are untouchable. As Reiner disappeared through the doors, his voice still echoing down the halls, the reality of the moment settled in. Langston's lawyer stood, visibly shaken. Your Honor, he stopped himself, realizing the judge he was about to address was now a criminal. He turned to the court clerk instead. This trial is now compromised. We need a new judge. Pam turned her attention to Robert Langston, the billionaire at the heart of the scandal. Oh, don't worry, she said, stepping toward him. We're not done here. Langston, who had spent the entire morning sitting confidently at the defense table, now looked less sure of himself. I don't know what you think you have on me, Ms. Bondi, but I am a legitimate businessman. Pam raised an eyebrow. Oh? Is that what you told yourself when you wired millions to offshore accounts? When you laundered government funds through shell corporations? Or maybe when you secured an illegal dismissal from a corrupt judge? Langston's jaw clenched. You have no proof. Pam smiled. Then you won't mind if I present my next witness. She turned to the courtroom doors and nodded. The doors swung open, and in walked the last person Robert Langston ever expected to see. The courtroom doors creaked open and a hush fell over the room. All eyes turned toward the figure stepping inside, a man in a crisp navy suit, his face pale but determined. Robert Langston's confidence evaporated in an instant. His fingers twitched, gripping the table so hard that his knuckles turned white. No, this is a trick. Pam Bondi smiled, watching the color drain from Langston's face. Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to introduce our next witness, Mr. Victor Haynes, former CFO of Langston Global. A wave of murmurs rippled through the courtroom. Victor Haynes had vanished from the public eye nearly a year ago, rumored to have fled the country after being accused of financial misconduct. Yet here he was, walking toward the witness stand with steady steps, ready to deliver the testimony that could bring Langston down. Langston stood abruptly, pointing at Haynes. This man is a fugitive. He embezzled from my company. He's a criminal. Pam raised a hand to silence the outburst. Sit down, Mr. Langston. You'll have your turn to speak. The judge, an impartial replacement brought in at the last moment, nodded. The witness may proceed. Victor Haynes took a deep breath before speaking into the microphone. For years, I managed Robert Langston's financial empire. I oversaw transactions, handled corporate accounts, and was responsible for ensuring our books were clean. But the truth is, they were never clean. He turned to the jury. I was instructed to move large sums of money, millions of dollars, into offshore accounts. At first, I thought it was just creative tax structuring. But then I saw the patterns. The money wasn't just disappearing, it was being used to bribe government officials, secure illegal contracts, and most importantly, pay off judges like Malcolm Reiner to ensure Robert Langston's business dealings remained untouchable. Langston's attorney jumped up. Objection. Hearsay. Pam didn't flinch. Your Honor, the prosecution has bank statements, wire transfers, and emails, all of which corroborate Mr. Haynes's testimony. The judge nodded. Objection overruled. Continue, Mr. Haynes. Victor leaned forward, staring at Langston. I tried to leave. I told him I wanted out. His voice wavered slightly, but he pressed on. But Langston doesn't let people leave. Within days, false accusations were levied against me. My accounts were frozen, my passport flagged. I was framed for embezzlement and suddenly I was the criminal. I had no choice but to disappear. Langston shook his head, laughing bitterly. This is pathetic. You're a liar, Haynes. A washed-up, desperate. Pam slammed a folder onto the prosecution table, cutting him off. Desperate? Maybe. But a liar? I don't think so. She turned to the judge. Your Honor, I'd like to submit into evidence an audio recording. It was obtained legally through federal surveillance and features Mr. Langston discussing his arrangement with Judge Reiner. The judge nodded. Proceed. The courtroom went silent as the audio clip played over the speakers. Langston's voice crackled through the speakers. 2 million, just like before. Reiner gets the money, we get the ruling. I don't care what the jury decides, he'll overrule them. And if anyone asks questions, I'll make sure they don't ask a second time. The weight of the words settled over the courtroom like a storm cloud. Pam folded her arms. Care to explain that, Mr. Langston? Langston's face turned red with fury. His lawyer whispered something frantically, but it was clear there was no talking his way out of this. Pam stepped closer. This is bigger than you, Langston. The bribes, the fraud, the rigged cases, you thought you could keep it hidden forever. But justice has a way of catching up. Langston swallowed hard. For the first time, he realized what was happening. The walls were closing in, and the fall of Malcolm Reiner was only the beginning. Robert Langston sat frozen, his face drained of all arrogance. The courtroom walls seemed to close in around him as the audio recording's final words echoed in his ears. He had spent years building an untouchable empire, bribing judges, silencing whistleblowers, and laundering millions. And now, in a matter of minutes, Pam Bondi had ripped it all apart. His lawyer leaned in, whispering frantically, "We need to cut a deal. Now." Langston didn't respond. His mind raced for a way out, but there wasn't one. Judge Malcolm Reiner was already in handcuffs. His most trusted CFO, Victor Haynes, had flipped, and Pam Bondi wasn't stopping until he was behind bars. Pam turned toward the jury, her voice steady. Ladies and gentlemen, justice is only as strong as those willing to defend it. Robert Langston and Judge Reiner believed they could control the law, twist it to their advantage, and silence anyone who stood in their way. She gestured toward the evidence table. But the facts don't lie. The bank records, the wire transfers, the whistleblower testimony, and now this damning audio clip. It all points to one conclusion. She turned back to Langston. Guilt. Langston's lawyer shot up from his seat. Your Honor, my client is prepared to cooperate with federal authorities in exchange for leniency. Pam didn't look surprised. She had anticipated this. When cornered, men like Langston always tried to bargain their way out. The judge peered over his glasses. Ms. Bondi, how does the prosecution wish to proceed? Pam took a calculated pause. She knew Langston had information, potentially about others in power who were involved in this corruption network. Accepting a deal could expose more criminals. But she also knew the American people wanted justice, and they wouldn't accept a mere slap on the wrist for a billionaire who had cheated the system. Finally, she spoke. The prosecution is open to cooperation, but only under strict terms. She turned to Langston. If you want a deal, Mr. Langston, you will provide the names of every official you have bribed, every corporation you have defrauded, and every judge who played a role in your criminal enterprise. You will surrender all assets tied to these schemes and agree to serve a minimum of 20 years in federal prison. Langston's lawyer looked horrified. 20 years? That's outrageous. Pam arched an eyebrow. Then we'll see you in court. Langston's face twisted with fury. He had spent decades controlling outcomes, making people bend to his will. But now, with the entire country watching, he had no control at all. The judge glanced at Langston. Mr. Langston, you may confer with your attorney, but let me be clear. Ms. Bondi is offering you more mercy than you deserve. Langston clenched his jaw. He knew he was trapped. After a long silence, he gave the smallest nod. Pam nodded back. Then let's get to work. The courtroom erupted into noise. Reporters rushed to send out breaking news updates. Billionaire Robert Langston agrees to cooperation deal amid corruption scandal. Attorney General Pam Bondi brings down another power player. But Pam wasn't celebrating yet, because she knew something no one else did. Robert Langston wasn't the last name on her list, and the real mastermind behind the corruption was still out there. Pam Bondi stood outside the federal courthouse, the cold wind biting at her face as reporters crowded around. Their voices overlapped, questions flying at her from all directions. Attorney General Bondi, what's next for the investigation? Will other judges be implicated? Does Robert Langston's cooperation mean more arrests are coming? Pam lifted her hand, silencing the storm of voices. Justice doesn't end with one case. This is bigger than Langston or Judge Reiner. This is about the integrity of our legal system, and we will not stop until every corrupt official is held accountable. A murmur spread through the crowd. They could sense something in her tone. This wasn't just political rhetoric. She meant it. Pam's phone buzzed in her pocket. She pulled it out and glanced at the screen. It was a message from Agent Derek Mills. Langston is talking. You were right. There's someone else. Pam's stomach tightened. She had suspected all along that Langston and Reiner were just pieces of a larger puzzle. But now she had confirmation. She turned back to the reporters. No further comments at this time. Then, without another word, she strode toward her car, her mind already racing ahead. Robert Langston sat across from Pam, his hands cuffed to the table. His once perfect suit was wrinkled, his hair disheveled. He looked like a man who had finally accepted his fate. Pam sat down, placing a thick folder between them. Start talking. Langston exhaled, leaning forward. You want the truth? His lips curled into a bitter smile. I was never the top of the food chain, Bondi. I was just playing the game. Pam narrowed her eyes. Then tell me who was pulling the strings. Langston hesitated. He glanced at the mirrored wall, knowing that FBI agents were watching from the other side. He licked his lips before speaking. There's a man. He paused. No, there's a judge. Higher than Reiner. More powerful. He's been orchestrating this whole operation for years. Pam's fingers tightened around her pen. Name. Langston's eyes locked onto hers. And then he said it. Pam's heart nearly stopped. The name was Justice Howard Whitaker, a sitting Supreme Court justice. Pam stood in her office, staring at the files before her. Everything she had fought for, everything she had uncovered, had led to this moment. Judge Reiner's corruption was just the surface. Robert Langston was just a pawn. The real kingpin, the man who had ensured corrupt rulings at the highest level, was none other than one of the most powerful justices in the nation. This wasn't just about one trial anymore. It was about the integrity of the Supreme Court. Pam exhaled, her jaw tightening. She reached for her phone and dialed Agent Mills. Derek, she said, her voice steady. Get me a federal task force. We're taking down a Supreme Court justice. There was a brief pause on the other end. Then Mills spoke. I hope you know what you're starting. Pam smiled grimly. I do. And I'm not stopping until it's finished. As she hung up, she knew one thing for certain: this battle was far from over. But justice was finally coming for the untouchable.